everyone! So I made this little informational video to talk about Turner syndrome simply because not a lot of people have heard about it, or maybe you have, but you don't know a whole lot about it. Maybe you just got a diagnosis and you're looking to learn more. Well, whoever you are, I'm glad you're watching, so let's get going. And this should be obvious, but I'm not a doctor or anything. I'm just someone with Turner syndrome that wants to get information out there. Some fun facts to start us off. The color most associated with Turner syndrome is purple. I'm not quite sure how that came to be, but that's just what it is. The symbol or the icon that represents Turner syndrome is actually the butterfly. It started out as the logo for the Turner Syndrome Society of the United States, but then it became more of like a general symbol. So now we even refer to each other as butterflies and things like that. The butterfly is supposed to represent femininity and strength. I've also heard that it's supposed to look like an X, like for the single X chromosome. I don't really see that, but oh well. And yeah, Turner Syndrome Awareness Month is February. So this is a karyotype, which essentially shows all the chromosomes that a person has, all nice and neat. Chromosomes being the large structures that DNA is organized into. Most people have 23 pairs of chromosomes, the 22 numbered pairs, as well as either two X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome. But people with Turner syndrome have just one X chromosome, and that's it. That's why there's a little box around the X, because typically people have either two X's or an X and a Y, but instead we just have one X. At its most basic, that's what Turner syndrome is. So if you're at all curious about how Turner syndrome is caused, it's through something called non-disjunction. If you're not all that interested in the biology of it, you can skip past the next couple of slides of biology nerdiness. But if you're interested, stick around. If you haven't heard of non-disjunction, I will explain it. If you look at the first column, that's how cells are supposed to divide, into two and then into two again. And this is meiosis, so it's creating gametes, which are egg and sperm cells. However, you see that in the other two columns, that sometimes this process of dividing doesn't go so smoothly, and that's what we call cell non-disjunction. Sometimes it just doesn't split evenly. As for how this specifically creates Turner's, even researchers can't give a complete explanation. There are also different types of Turner syndrome, so that probably has a lot to do with it. And if you know about other chromosomal conditions, you also might have noticed that there are a lot more variations in sex chromosomes than in autosomes, which are the numbered chromosomes. Why might that be? Well, it has to do a lot with Barr bodies. Basically, every cell in your body has one functional copy of the X chromosome. If you have more than one X chromosome, the other or others go through X activation and are made into Barr bodies. The result is that those with Turner syndrome just don't have any Barr bodies, at least in the 45XO cells. This same thing applies to those with XY chromosomes, so it's not really uncommon. The two main types of Turner syndrome are classic Turner syndrome and mosaic Turner syndrome. Classic Turner's is when all of your cells have the 45XO karyotype that we saw before, meaning 45 chromosomes total and just one X chromosome and then nothing. Mosaic Turner syndrome is when some cells do and some cells do not have the 45XO karyotype. Think of it more like an art mosaic. Most of the time, the other cells are quote-unquote normal with either XX or XY. If you're at all curious, I have mosaic Turner syndrome. It's important to note that those with mosaic forms of Turner syndrome often have less complications to the condition. However, this means that it's often caught later because it isn't noticed. Now that we've gotten into what Turner syndrome is, how is it diagnosed? Anecdotally, there are three main ways that people tend to find out that they have Turner syndrome. That isn't to say that people don't find out other ways, but these are the big common themes that I've heard. The first is that the parents get prenatal tests done that indicate that their future child may have Turner's. This can be useful so that everyone knows right away that that's a possibility and there's not really a period of guesswork and suspecting later. The second way people tend to get diagnosed is when they just don't grow as fast as their peers that are the same age as them. This was the case for me. I was diagnosed when I was 6 and I was the shortest person in my class. My parents took me to a physician to see if there was anything of concern, and eventually I got my Turner syndrome diagnosis. I say eventually because I was tested for a number of different things, and Turner's was one of the last conditions they checked for. Just goes to show how important awareness is. Anyway, the third way people tend to get a Turner syndrome diagnosis is when they become teenagers and they just don't enter puberty. Their peers will be going through all the changes and they won't have those things happen to them. People will typically go to a physician if they are, say, like 16 and they've had no signs of developing. Mostly it's that they haven't started their period. So all of these things can lead to suspicions of Turner syndrome, but you'll need to get a karyotype done to have an official diagnosis. Most of the time this involves a blood test, which is always a joy, and then you'll hear back from your ordering physician and they'll let you know what the results are. Some common Turner syndrome traits include all of these. The webbed neck, small lower jaw, and low set ears are typically seen at birth and infancy, but not everybody has them, and if they do, it's often not seen once they start growing. Really, people with Turner's look like anyone else. As I mentioned before, those with Turner syndrome don't grow as tall as others. I am 5'3" or 161 centimeters, but that's actually quite tall, all things considered. It's thanks to growth hormone that I reach this height. The average height of someone with Turner's who has not taken growth hormone is 4'8" or 142 centimeters. Differences in sexual development we also kind of touched on. Nothing's going to happen until you start taking medication. And then infertility. Yes, unfortunately, most people who have Turner syndrome cannot conceive naturally. And even though there are a number that technically can, it's always considered a high-risk pregnancy. The knowledge that you'll likely not be able to have biological children affects each person differently. And for some, it's even the most difficult part of having Turner syndrome. I like to think I've taken it in stride, but then again, I've never really wanted to have children anyway. So there's that. Here are some common health problems associated with Turner syndrome. Cardiovascular issues, so a lot of heart and circulatory system conditions, including high blood pressure and even coarctation of the aorta. Bone health, so your bones could easily become brittle, especially if you don't take estrogen. Ear infections and hearing problems, these are two separate things, but they're somewhat linked. Ear infections are common, especially for children. I know I had a lot of ear infections growing up. And then hearing loss is also something to look out for with a hearing test. And there's obviously a range for hearing loss, so you may not even notice it at first, which is why it's so important to get checked. Kidney problems are also a big one, such as horseshoe kidney. Some people with Turner syndrome do have learning disabilities. Yeah, that doesn't mean we're not smart. People with Turner syndrome actually are of average intelligence. However, sometimes things like spatial reasoning can be a bit off. So if you verbally tell me directions to go somewhere, I will get lost. I need a map that I can follow directly. And last but not least, and this is a less common one, but still really important, is any condition that's X-linked recessive will be more prevalent among those with Turner syndrome than among people with two X chromosomes. This is because there's no chance for a dominant allele to cover it up, per se. The best example I can think of at the moment is color blindness. Of course, it has to run in your family already, but those with Turner syndrome are more prone to being, say, colorblind than those with two X chromosomes because of the fact that we only have one. Alright, so by now, you're probably thinking, well, how is all of this handled? Basically, you have a primary care provider, but on top of that, you have specialists that you visit every so often, depending on how often they tell you. Which specialists will depend on your specific needs, but everyone should at least visit an endocrinologist and a cardiologist. Most of the time, these are outpatient visits, and they don't have to be super complex. Usually it's just a check-in to see how things are going and possibly adjust the dosage of medications. Now, the medications that people with Turner syndrome take are these. The first thing you take is growth hormone. I personally started taking this when I was 6, and then I took it until I was 15. Your endocrinologist will tell you when the best time to start and end is, because that's different for everybody. One thing to know is that this is given by a daily injection. Yay! It's really not that bad, but if you have a fear of needles, it can be daunting at first. But you get used to it. So yeah, I know how to give myself an injection even though I have no formal training. So then, once you become a teenager, you will start taking estrogen. And this is the American spelling. It's spelled with the O at the beginning in British English. The purpose of taking estrogen is to kickstart puberty. Once that starts taking effect, you'll start to notice changes such as breast growth and hips widening and things like that. Estrogen also helps keep bones healthy, like I mentioned before, so it helps a lot with those bone conditions. And then a little while after that, you'll start taking progesterone. Eventually, most people get prescribed a combination estrogen and progesterone tablet, which will probably be more well-known and more well-recognized as a birth control pill. Like those who take it for birth control, you take the medicine for 3 weeks, and then you have a week where you don't take the medicine, and instead you take an inert pill. The week you're off the medicine is when you have your period, or your withdrawal bleeding, to be more precise. Sometimes it takes a month or two once you start, but this is how people with Turner syndrome start having their period. All right, we're almost to the end. And these are just the questions that a lot of people ask, so I thought I'd put them here. Is Turner syndrome inherited? No, it is not. Except in certain cases where the mother has Turner syndrome, but we already mentioned that most people can't have biological children anyway. Can Turner syndrome be prevented? Nope, doesn't matter the age of the mother, and it has no correlation to what they were doing throughout their pregnancy. Obviously, that doesn't mean it's safe to drink or do drugs or things like that while pregnant. There are other repercussions, but those things do not affect the chances of Turner's. How common is Turner syndrome? 1 in 2,000 or 1 in 2,500 live female births is the quoted statistic. However, some say that might not be accurate, and so it may be time for a recount. Can biological males be diagnosed with Turner syndrome? It's super, super rare. I've never met a biological male with Turner syndrome, but it can happen. As an aside, people with Turner syndrome can identify as any gender, just like anyone else, but as far as being assigned male at birth, being biologically male, it's very, 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 very rare. The Turner Syndrome Society of the United States says that in the United States, although rare, biological males are diagnosed with Turner syndrome. International experts, however, agree that biological males should not be diagnosed with Turner syndrome, but use their karyotype as their diagnosis. It took me a few reads to fully comprehend that, but what it's saying is that in the US, yes, biological males are diagnosed with Turner's. However, internationally, in general, they are not diagnosed with Turner's, but rather their karyotype is their diagnosis. And last but not least is Turner syndrome an intersex condition. There's not really a consensus on this, and it's one of those things that could be debated until the end of time. Hopefully it's not, but I tend to think yes it is. But there are others who say it's not, and honestly both sides have valid points. It depends on your definition of intersex, really. If that's a topic of interest to you, I was reading this paper not too long ago, Shifting Syndromes, Sex Chromosome Variations, and Intersex Classifications. You also be able to find it if you look it up online. It goes into kind of the history of Turner syndrome as well as Klinefelter syndrome and how they relate to the intersex community. Lastly, I just wanted to leave this for anyone who's watching who may have recently gotten diagnosed with Turner syndrome or maybe know someone who recently got diagnosed with Turner syndrome. I just want to say that even though it seems scary, I promise you'll get through it. It'll be okay. Just learn as much as you can and be sure you can advocate for yourself in front of a physician. You have a bright future ahead of you. Well, that's it from me. I appreciate you sticking around to hear my rambling, and I hope you learned something new. Bye!